Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It is Tuesday, March 18th, 2025 at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So we're beginning our discussion this afternoon to talk about an amendment proposal with funding formula for developing families in the state. And there was, I think, to tee it up a little bit before Beth runs us through some proposed language that I think it's fair to say, and I haven't talked with Secretary Saunders about this, but I think there's a difference between statute and board of education rule. And statute generally trumps a rule from board. And so, and this rule has been in effect, I understand, since 1999. And I think it's been the decision of the agency to follow the statute. But what that has done, the rule by the board provided the ability to add weights to the funding, and without utilizing the board's rule, the weights are gone. And so we've seen, I think in the proposed RFP, that there could be 9 counties that could see decreases in funding, and those will be our rural counties. And so I've been having conversations with Chair of Education and others as well. And they are a little tight on time with what they're doing. And so because we do have a joint jurisdiction on adult education, I asked if they minded if we took testimony on it. I think they were okay with that. I've spoken with the speaker as well. So we're going to take a look at that, better understand what the issue is, and there's a proposal made. So I think I'll ask Beth just to walk us through the proposed amendment. There may be a different that you may want to consider as well, but yeah, welcome. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm going to share my screen here. Is that okay, size-wise? Okay. So we're going to walk through this miscellaneous amendment. It's not right now attached to a specific piece of legislation, so there's no section number or anything above or below it. And what this language is proposing to do is make an amendment to Section 4011 of Title 16. Section 4011 lives in Chapter 133 of Title 16, which is the education funding chapter. So all of our school, not all, but that is home base for most of our school finance laws. And so this section is entitled Education Payments, and it is where, in subsection F, language about the funding for adult education and literacy programs lives. And you can see, again, anything that's struck through as current law, and the proposal is to get rid of it. Anything that's underlined is new language that is being proposed to be added. And anything that is neither struck through nor underlined is current law that is being proposed to be kept. That was not eloquent at all. I just wanted to acknowledge that. So if we were to read what the change is, it would read, annually from funds appropriated for this subsection to the agency in an amount equal to 26% of the base education amount for each student who completes the diagnostic portions of an adult education and secondary credential program, based on an average of the previous 2 years, the secretary shall pay to a local adult education and literacy provider, as defined in Section 942 of this title. That's the adult education statute, the kind of the enabling authority for those programs, that provides an adult education and secondary credential program, an amount that shall be calculated pursuant to the funding formula contained in the State Board of Education adult education rules. And then the rest of the subsection, the proposal is to keep that the same. 40%, that 40% is only underlined because I capitalized it. The 40 existed prior to today, or it exists today. 40% of the payment required under the subsection shall be from state funds appropriated from the ed fund, and then 60% would come from the general fund. And that was a change that was added last year. Anything else I can provide? I have the state board rules up, if they would be helpful.
Anyone want to see the state board?
The state board rules talk about the weighting.
It's the funding formula.
Yep, might be helpful.
So these are the, avert your eyes while I scroll. These are the State Board of Education, Vermont adult education rules. These are current rules to my knowledge. And I believe, again, I don't work in the field. So I believe when we're referring to the adult basic education funding formula, this is what we are referring to, is Rule 2410. And it would be allocations to counties if they meet certain criteria. And I think I just heard a use of the term weights. And I think that that's a fair way to describe what this scheme does. These rules live on the State Board of Education's website, along with LexisNexis, who's the official holder of Vermont rules. I'd be happy to send a link to Anna Grace so you have it on your website. And I just want to point out, this is the last time these rules were amended. Anything else?
What's the citation again?
For the rules?
Yes.
Oh, it's the 2400 series, and it's Rule 2410.
In Rule 2410 is which portion of the amendments connects these two documents?
Great question. So current law in subsection F requires the secretary to pay an adult education provider an amount equal to 26% of the base education amount of a student who completes the diagnostic portion, period. This is requiring the appropriation to match that 26% of the base education amount per pupil. But then the allocation from AOE would follow this.
Thank you.
Was the allocation specified previously? Sorry, I didn't think they saw that in there.
Not in the statute itself.
Okay.
That's where the conflict is.
Okay.
And statute trump.
So just for clarification, I think you said this, but I just wanted, so the adult education services had been budgeting based on the state board rule that has been in effect since we don't know who.
I don't know the answer to that question, unfortunately.
But the funding they had been funded that way. The funding changed for the current year.
All
Underlying.
I can confidently and ethically testify to you today is what is in current law and what this amendment would propose to do. And the way I read current law, the statute, Title 16, my home, is that the secretary is required to pay adult education providers an amount equal to 26% of the base education amount for each student who completes the diagnostic portion. Another way to say that, I think, would be a per pupil allocation, period. That's how I read the statute. And then this amendment is suggesting that the overall appropriation be calculated the same way, but from you all, but the allocation to the field would be calculated under the state board rule, which is not how 16 VSA section 4011 subsection F That's not what it currently says. I'm sorry to give you a non-answer answer.
It clarifies either way. Thank you.
Other questions for Beth? Thank you, Beth.
You're welcome. I will be with you all for another 15 minutes.
Know where to find you anyway.
Oh, yes.
Joe?
Representative Marca, Catherine Kalkstein, my colleague from Central Vermont Adult Basic Ed is here. Do you mind if she joins us? Okay, great.
I'm Michelle Fost. I am a resident of Irisburg. I'm also a dedicated adult education literacy provider in the Northeast Kingdom for the last 25 years, 15 years as the executive director of Northeast Kingdom Learning Services.
I'm Catherine Kalkstein. I'm a resident of Payson, Vermont, and I'm the executive director of Central Vermont Adult Education. And our home base is in Barrie, but we serve Washington, Orange, and the North counties.
And the three counties that the Northeast Kingdom serves are Orleans, Caledonia, and Essex. So we're here today to address the negative financial consequences resulting from the February 27th release of the RFP. The RFP is Vermont's WIOA state combined state plan states that AEL services are funded through a competitive grant process managed by the Agency of Education. This is not a new process. This is something that we've gone through many, many times, the RFP process. Historically, funding has been distributed based on county funding formula, which is what Beth alluded to. She did a great job explaining the county formula, and so that there's a base allocation of $30,000 per county, and then the remainder is distributed based on comparative need and regional density of need. The funding model, while imperfect, did recognize regional disparities and attempted to ensure equitable resource distribution. However, the newly released RFP has abandoned this model, which has led to significant funding shifts. The RFP now states that funding must be allocated according to state law, the statute. And what's a bit frustrating is that the stakeholders, including the adult education and literacy providers and the Adult Education and Literacy Student Access Committee, had previously identified the necessity of revising Rule 2410 to modernize the funding formula equitably as far back as January of 2024. And more recently, in November and December of 2024, the ongoing concern of a possible shift like this and the impact was raised again with the agency leadership. Despite this, there was no response from the agency until the RFP was released without any further provider input or revision of the existing rule. So the impact of shifting from this per pupil model to the what was the county formula is that 9 counties, so Orleans, Bennington, Windsor, Addison, Orange, Franklin, Caledonia, Grand Isle, and Essex, all are going to experience funding cuts as of July 1st. 2 of them in the $25,000 to $50,000 range, 3 of them in the $50,000 to $100,000 range, 3 in the $100,000 to $200,000 range, and Essex County with the greatest impact of a reduction of $363,000. 5 counties will increase funding benefiting from the student per student model. Lamoille and Rutland County will have minimal increases, $7,500 and $9,400 respectively. Windham County will see an increase of $148,000, with Washington County seeing an increase of $427,000, and Chittenden County receiving an increase of $569,000. Since the mid-1960s, NAKLS has been a pillar of adult education and literacy in the kingdom, providing life-changing opportunities to individuals seeking to improve their lives through education and workforce. Our work is vital and our impact is proven, as is with the rest of the partners in the state. Under the current 2-year grant with the Agency of Education in fiscal year 2025, our state grant requires us to serve 200 students. Currently, we are exceeding that target and serving over 200 individuals with an expectation to reach 220. Historically, we've been asked to serve 180 to 200 students in our region. So our organization consistently achieves the highest performance measures in the state, demonstrating our effectiveness in delivering quality education and workforce training. NEKLS alone faces a funding reduction of $577,822, leading to severe consequences, including NEKLS will have to close our full service center located in Hardwick. We will have to reduce services at our full service St. Johnsbury and Newport centers. We will have to close our satellite centers in Canaan and Island Pond. We will have to eliminate staff, both full-time and part-time, including teachers, specialized tutors, support staff, and our community outreach and marketing position. These cuts will severely hinder our ability to serve our target of 200 students, jeopardizing the progress and success of adult learners who rely on us for education and career development. NEKLS has been at the forefront of workforce development, particularly in the mandated integrated education and training initiatives. This is an IET is required as part of our grant to deliver this type of training. So one of our most successful programs, the Step Up to Workforce program, provides pre-training models tailored to Vermont workforce needs. In the Kingdom, the workforce initiatives that are at risk with this is the Step Up to Childcare, which was our first IET program. It has 20 participants in the first two trainings. 14 are now employed in the childcare sector. Several have pursued higher education in early childhood at CCV, and several realized childcare was not the field for them. This program not only fills critical childcare workforce gaps, but also provides a no-risk, no-cost trial for participants and host childcares. This program has also been approved as eligible for VSAC grants, which helps in sustainability of the model. Step Up to Paraprofessional is our second IET that was recently approved last week by the agency, and we are launching a pilot program at Hazen Union High School with plans to expand regionally. This initiative will meet an immediate need identified by a school and serve as potential pipeline into Vermont's teaching workforce. This course also will be eligible for VSAC grants. We have been working for the past year on a Step Up to Health Careers in collaboration with Allied Health Career Education of Northern Vermont. Yesterday, we held our first of two stakeholder meetings in St. Johnsbury, where we were hearing directly from the healthcare providers in our region with what they need most right now. Our second stakeholder meeting will take place on March 31st in Newport. With their input, we will collaboratively create the first Step Up to Health Careers to address these urgent needs. Our first cohort is slated to begin January of 2026. A cut like this will put that in jeopardy. The final one we're working on right now is a Step Up to Construction. NEKLS was recently awarded a highly competitive $20,000 national grant to launch this program using Vermont CTE's NCCER curriculum to provide pathways into trades such as plumbing, HVAC, electrical, and carpentry. This program will allow us to support the CTE programs with a meaningful pre-training program for their higher level trainings. However, due to the potential funding cuts, we are unable to confirm acceptance of this grant at this time. Act 76, I want to mention, established the Adult Education and Literacy High School Completion Student Access Committee to provide recommendations in its reports to the Joint Fiscal Committee and the House and Senate Committees on Education on how to increase equity and education access to adult education programs. Page 3 of that committee report states the recommended changes outlined in this proposal will support and sustain an adult education and training system that is rigorous and accessible to every adult Vermonter so that they can earn a secondary credential, prepare for post-secondary education, develop the skills and training necessary to enter or advance in the workforce, and be an active, engaged, informed citizen in their communities. Nothing about the actions of the AOE are achieving either this language goals outlined in Act 78 for increase in equity and education access, or the goals of the legislatively convened committee to support and sustain an adult education and training system. Furthermore, the Adult Education and Literacy Access Committee report made additional recommendations for next steps because, as was acknowledged by the committee and the AOE, it was understood that the system was complex with decades of different legislation and rules and policy to unwind, and thus that this needed to be an iterative process built on collaboration and cooperation. The AOE and AELN proposed the following activities to occur if the legislation was adopted. Revise State Board Rule 2400 to reflect legislative changes, align with State Board workforce governance and WIOA state combined state plan, and modernize the formula for distributing funds equitably. We've known about this for over a year. This isn't new. Many of the documents that have been produced by Secretary Saunders explaining the proposed changes to the K-12 system speak to evidence-based per pupil funding being weighted, that there are weights to target additional resources to support student needs for economically disadvantaged students, ELL students, and career and tech students. So, I mean, it even kind of flies in the face of what we're trying to do in transformation of education for the state as a whole. You know, nothing about the decision has been in the manner in which it has been made and communicated that suggests that we're looking at evidence-based, weights based on student needs, weights based on geographic scarcity, and consideration of the student. First and foremost, everything we do is about the students. It's about the student goals, outcomes. It's about improving their lives. So I, as Northeast Kingdom Learning Services, want to reiterate the letter that was sent with all of our signatures, the colleagues, to the secretary asking for the RFP to be repealed immediately, to reconsider the implications of funding shift, and to work towards the creation of an equitable allocation model that reflects regional disparities. It is really important, and this is the language that was presented. The network was able to meet this morning and talk a little bit more about the proposed language. And one of the things that's really important to us is that we get it right this time, that the language we put in there this time, or that gets put in there this time, will stand and will be able to stand through, through the future. Right now, it currently mentions the state board rules, but if we look at the education reform bill, it reads that there might be a shift in responsibility of the State Board of Education and in regards to adult education and literacy. So we don't want to find ourselves in a situation where we're having to come back again and adjust the language. So I think that's really important. Modernizing the funding formula by a certain date. It would be ideal if, just like in the past, when legislation has asked for a study committee to study the access issue, if a study committee could also be required to specifically study the funding formula with folks at the table from the Agency of Education, legislators, and AELN, or the Adult Ed Literacy Network representation. I'm going to hand it over to Catherine to let her chime in on things from her perspective as Central Vermont Adult Basic Education, Adult Ed.
Sure. Actually, I will sort of speak on behalf of the network, and I just want to, let you all know that we did work very hard last legislative session to get the appropriation number changed, because the field hadn't seen a meaningful change in our funding for several decades. And so that was what we were after. The sort of second piece of the work that we were doing, as Michelle mentioned, was in the report, the Adult Education and Literacy report that the study committee generated. There was a second piece, and that was the revised state board rules to modernize that funding formula with a collaborative group of people, good representation from the agency, from the field, and from the legislature to come up with a fair model for funding. So I guess I just want to reiterate that the network is in alignment with the funding formula needing to be revised, and we're hoping that work can happen. So we are also in alignment with asking you all to repeal the current RFP. It is a 3-year RFP, so if it were to go into effect, the ramifications for the system for the next couple of years could be fairly destabilizing and devastating for certain communities. So the language that we had in front of you that Beth St. James showed earlier just needs to be, I think, maybe a little expanded a bit to include the piece about having a study committee with a clear date by which it needs to be completed, so that we can figure this all out before the RFP, a new RFP, were this to happen, could be issued next spring.
and I may not understand, it's the is the FY 26 to 28 RFP next spring, the timetable still works with that.
So it begins July 1st, 2025, and it goes through June 30th of 2028. So if the RFP, which is due April 25th, and awards are made to the different counties, that they would have to implement for July 1st based on whatever funding is allocated.
Positing an RFP issued next spring. I guess I missed that.
If we, so one of our recommendations is that we are asking that the current RFP that is out there be immediately
Yep.
pulled back, and that we just move forward for one more year
Okay,
with the
thank you.
current contracts. And then once the committee, a committee can meet and work on the funding formula, it would be ready for.
27 to 29.
Right, so the ask is
Yeah.
to just pull the RFP back, extend our current contracts for 1 year. And during that 1 year, commit through a legislative action, a study committee convened specifically to identify a funding formula that is equitable and, meets the needs of the students in the different regions. And then the RFP process, because WIOA does state that these funds have to be allocated, have to go out to bid. Yeah.
So just with the question that I asked earlier is you were budgeting for next year based on current year rules? Or you were waiting for this RFP to begin budgeting for next year?
We all knew that this may come. So we've all been trying to, figure out like, what does that look like? Which is why it was so important for us to know sooner rather than later that the allocation through the RFP was going to be made in this way. Not that I think the 3 counties in the Northeast Kingdom would have been able to find enough bridge funding to cover that. But it's just, there was a body of work that should have happened that didn't happen for a variety of reasons. Competing responsibilities, lack of staffing. I'm sure it's not because somebody was just sitting in the corner saying, no, we don't want to do this, right? But that was work that needed to be done so that we aren't sitting here today in this situation where 9 counties are having to cut their budgets by 100,000, 180,000, or, for us in the 3 county regions that all received a hit, 577,000. As you can imagine, that's pretty devastating to a region.
But so we're not the education committee, so just for the committee, adult education isn't run by county, right? So the funding goes to the bigger organization, which may have pluses and minuses within
Right.
it, right?
Right.
It probably, right.
It currently does, but as a competitive process, some other organization or entity could step forward and apply for funds for any one of the counties in the state. Or multiple counties in the state.
And then my last question, I know there are other people in the room that do have the answer. I'm curious if you have the answer also. According to WIOA, if we extended the contract, are we still within their guidelines of having an RFP at the right timeline?
There's been times in the past that I know we've had to go to Octay, and the agency had to go to Octay and ask it or explain that there were extenuating circumstances, COVID, whatever, to push out the RFP process. So I feel like there is a path for that question to be addressed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jerry Saunders. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon. For the record, I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education. I want to note that I was not able to see the amendment until just before this meeting. So I haven't had the opportunity to engage our legal counsel at the Agency of Education to answer that very question that was just asked, which is if we were to entertain repealing this, if that would be in alignment with WIOA and federal requirements. So that is an important question to answer that I will be following up with the agency counsel to give clarity on. I think as a point of background and just clarification, the change occurred, as we just heard, because there was a need to modernize the funding for adult education and literacy programs. And the General Assembly passed statutory changes to address that. As has been noted, the agency is required to implement those laws, and we have done so per the specifications outlined in state statute. The shift that was made was shifting from a census-based funding approach by county to understanding by funding by students. And so what that's doing is ensuring that those students that are serving a larger number of students are benefiting from the additional resources to meet those students' needs. As we've noted in some of the analysis that we've done, there was a very large gap where you would have counties that received similar funding, but really served very different number of students. And so the intention was to ensure that the dollars were appropriately resourcing the providers to provide services to students. I think it's also important to note a bigger question here as we think about root cause, as we think about the ability to serve more adults, I think is an important question for us to explore and entertain. And what are some of those mechanisms by which we can increase the reach, scope, and impact in counties where adults are not participating at high levels. So I think that is an important part of this conversation that I hope we also will address in thinking about how we can best meet the needs of students and provide those services. I also want to note that this program has always been a competitive grant program. This is not an entitlement program. So as it would follow normal procedures, providers would apply, and meeting the criteria, funding would be awarded as such. So I just want to clarify that, because there's never a guarantee with funding as you're thinking about a competitive grant-making process. But I'm open to answering any additional questions. I do want to flag again that I have not gotten counsel from AOE legal team at this time, but will do so and follow up in writing around any other considerations. It's certainly important for us that we're able to implement the statute as defined and also comply with federal requirements.
Do you have a sense of what your funding looks like for next year?
Meaning what we've awarded through the grant making program or the overall funding
I
amount?
guess the overall, I guess coming from the federal government, like what?
It's more of your question, are we anticipating any adjustments?
Yeah.
So obviously that's kind of a bigger question as we're thinking about the federal landscape. Our team provided testimony around to provide a federal update. In terms of what we can anticipate, there is some uncertainty in, I think, the 26-27 school year. We have relative confidence around funding levels for next academic year. We do know that there has been a reduction in force at the U.S. Department of Education, but largely the supports for career and technical education, that staffing has remained intact as far as we can tell at this point. So we do know that continues to be a priority and an area of bipartisan, I think, support in thinking about adult education and career and technical education. So somewhat speculative, but those are some of the tea leaves that we can read.
I'm curious about the attendance at the grant applicant virtual workshops that you hosted earlier this month. And that may not be something that you have with you today, but I'm wondering if there were any attendees at those who are not current service providers.
Yes.
Is there a list that's public of who was at the attendance at those grant workshops?
I don't think that's been requested of us, but we would certainly be able to provide that as a.
Thank you.
I'm trying to understand what the base amount means. And I saw something that said there's currently 30,000 is the base amount. What does that mean? A student? I mean, I'm really kind of lost in terms of what that means. Is it attached to students? Is it attached to programs?
Yeah, I think in the state statute, that's the base amount, and then the dollars above that are based on the student participation, not based on census indicators of the county in the reformed statute.
But there's a base amount. Is that, what does that mean, a base amount? Is that, I don't know, I'm displaying my ignorance, but is that per student? Is that per program? What is that about 30,000?
I think your question is, right, what are the allowable grant activities with the use of those dollars? No.
Per county.
Oh, it's per county, yes.
County, there. Per county, anything within the county, not per student.
Right. 30,000 is the starting point, and then more money gets added.
And then,
based on-
I saw the additional. Thank you. One more question. So when the statute that you're applying right now is subsection F, and when was that version of subsection F enacted?
My understanding was last year. And
Just
that,
last year. Thank you.
My understanding of that subsection, the only change there was the percentages of money coming from the general fund and money coming from the ed fund. That language has been there for 25 years.
Yeah, so thank you for saying that. So the basic structure, I mean, the numbers changed, I guess, last year, but basic structure has been around for quite a while.
That's my
I think
understanding.
the rules that were referenced earlier from 1997 was the last time it was updated. And so I think the shift again is moving, the shift that happened was moving from funding based on county characteristics to students served. The starting point is still by county, that there's a base amount allocated, and then above that is based on the average 2-year participation of students.
Well, just briefly, I mean, what I'm thinking is whether people had fair notice when the last time the statute was amended, people had fair notice that something was going to change. Something changes in committee and get a lot of people, for and against it here and stuff like that. Well, you wouldn't know maybe whether that was possible.
So my understanding is last year there was a lot of conversation, and I think the adult education providers did express some concern around exactly what they're describing today. So there had been a conversation around that, and I think an understanding that the agency would be required to implement the new state statute. The specifics around, the funding amount came out with the RFP, as it would within a competitive process, as we're not allowed to give advance notice because that could, provide, preferential treatment of one provider over another. But I think there was clarity in the way that the funding was described in the statute to anticipate what the impacts would be based on student enrollment.
My discussions with legislative council, there's really no new statute. That the statute remained the same, it was just a change in funding from the ed fund and funding from the general fund. The underlying statute didn't change. That AOE was utilizing the board rule to implement. And I think there's a shift now of implementing the statute as it stands. That's my understanding. And so I guess the question I have, or the questions, is that there was a recommendation from the report that AOE work with the adult to come up with a better funding formula, more equitable. And that didn't happen. And now everything else that we do in education, we talk about weights. And there's no weights here. And so we're finding that our rural counties, because they have a harder time providing this education, are now being money taken away from them and given to counties that have an audience that's there, that it's much easier for them to provide. And so I think that's what we're trying to do, is figure out a formula that's equitable, fair to everybody. But we haven't done that yet. And so the ask is, can we either pull the RFP back and extend the contract if that's possible, or can we change the statute and put a new RFP out? And I know doing that puts the agency behind the 8 ball, because it's likely that this language will go into the budget and it won't be passed until close to July 1 or sometime in June. So we need to figure out what our options are and how we can work with you and work with the agency on coming up with a solution to make sure that we're not leaving our rural areas behind, making sure that the adults in those rural areas are able to get the education that they need. So I think that's where we are.
We share the goal of ensuring that our adults in rural areas are benefiting from these educational opportunities. So I want to start there. That's definitely a point of shared understanding and shared goal. I think when you look at the funding, and you look at the tables, what we were seeing historically is you could have a county serving 9 students and a county serving 94 students and being paid about the same amount. So I think that does signal that while we want to make sure that there is a reach in a rural community and that we're resourcing, that's a pretty big discrepancy for the same amount of funding. So I think it does underscore the need for adjusting that funding formula to ensure that we're appropriately resourcing adult education across the state. So I just want to name that that's true. And it's also true that we would like for adults in rural communities to take more advantage of these opportunities. And there may be further conversation around how best to do that. Are there different engagement strategies we want to employ or campaigns to help adults understand the opportunities available through these services? So I do hope we can entertain, and I will follow up on your specific question, but I hope we're able to have a broader conversation as well around how we're meeting the needs of adults across the state and addressing root cause. So if we're not seeing high levels of participation, why is that? And how can we support with extending our reach and scope in a funding system that's equitable?
I would agree with that 100%. But I think we need to do that before we start making these drastic changes to the rural areas. And how do we get there? And this is, I don't think this is going to get us there. I think it's going to wind up seeing drastic cuts and maybe things closing down or the, rural areas not being able to provide the services that they need to provide. So I fully agree that we really need to look at it, but we need to do that.
So I would ask that the committee allow me to engage with our legal counsel and also team leads who were supportive of this transition to come back and provide more detailed testimony.
That would be cool. That would help the town out.
We pulled this off in a few hours, so I think a couple days would be sufficient.
Set up, say Tuesday, if we set time up,
Friday or early next week, we can,
Friday afternoon or, yeah, probably Friday afternoon or next Tuesday. That would be great. I appreciate that. Any other questions?
I have a question for the adult learning folks. That's,
Yep, sure.
so while you're here, how yet been granted their degrees doing, right now?
So
Go ahead, you speak.
I mean, I think it depends on the students. Some of them are kind of in a holding pattern, wondering how they can move forward. There is a pathway for them to take the GED rather than getting a high school diploma, but unfortunately that can actually maybe not get them to their end goal, because there are some higher education programs that do not accept the GED with their high school diploma. So, we're really hoping that we can get them through as quickly as possible. They've done what they needed to do in terms of requirements. We just need to get the paperwork for the new program all ironed out so that we can move them forward and get the existing schools on board issuing those diplomas.
Right, the important piece for the students to be able to complete, and we did have students that were continuing to work on the plan that they had because that was the plan they had. Although it hadn't, it had been signed, but it had been signed towards the end of the fiscal year and before the July 1st date. So, in light of, the rollout of the ADP program being delayed, until February, they just continued to work on their plans. And so, one thing that we were concerned about was that, the ADP guidance says that those students, if they had a signed plan, could graduate, but only if the school signed the MOU for the ADP. And the question for us was, we actually had a school that was considering not funding. And so, that was the only discrepancy between what we requested and what was in the guidance. So, we're continuing to actively work with our students to finish their plans and successfully to move on to the next things.
It's not inhibiting students from going out into the job market, or is it?
It is.
It
And I think
is.
it depends upon the student.
Yeah.
But yes, we've had several of them who are we've had several difficult conversations
Yeah.
with students and with parents.
Thank you.
I think that's also an important part of the conversation is to acknowledge that the former program was repealed. And there's creation of a new adult diploma program that was developed with input from the field as well. And that there was a period where we were extending that right before it was fully sunsetted. So that is a dynamic in this that is important to bring in when we're talking about the changes.
So there is language in the BAA that addresses this issue that you're talking about, but the BAA hasn't passed yet. So that's kind of still on there. And I just wanted to clarify something that was asked earlier. In the new iteration of the funding, there is no base funding amount. That's in the old funding formula, Chimpanzee 400 series. There was a base allocation amount. And that was really the intent of that. I wasn't around then, but the intent of that, I believe, was that that 30,000 base would be, I'll put in quotes, enough for a county to be able to run a program. And certainly, as we know, in today's dollars,
In 1997.
in 1997, in today's dollars, that is not possible. But there is no, in this current formula that's in the RFP, there is no base funding amount. It's strictly per student.
Understood, because we're not using the board rule. Okay. So I don't want you going anywhere because we're.
I was going to talk about CTE until.
Switching our conversation. I appreciate if, if you can have those conversations with everyone, and how do we manage this year somehow, and then moving forward, come up with a better way of funding formula.
Yeah.
Thank you. Michelle, thanks, Kat. I
Thank you.
appreciate your time. We'll stay in touch. Okay. Now, let's start talking PPE. So we had put something together. I should take a look at it, comment, see, get your thoughts. I think this is just gonna be a process where we throw things out and start.
Mhm.
We need a place to start from. And this gives us a place and
So I'm solo today and I want to share why, because Ruth Durkee is getting a very important award today by her peers for being an excellent career and technical education educator. So just really proud of her accomplishments and wanted you all to know that that's where she is. She was going to patch in, but this is actually the exact time that they are presenting her with the award.
it would be a great thing to have.
Yes, we should just actually have her up on the screen so that we can applaud as she gets her award. So I'm really proud of her at the agency. I think we can be really proud of her at the state for all of her contributions and her commitment. So if there are specific questions that would need Ruth to answer, I'll note those and she'll be able to follow up. Mainly what I was hoping we could talk about today is, how we navigate the development of this policy, recognizing that there's also broader conversations around education transformation. And I think the legislation as proposed, the bill that was introduced, largely assumes the current education system. And so what we've tried to do is think about our recommendations in the context of the current state. Should there be no changes to how we govern or fund our education system? And then how those recommendations might change in a reform state where we are changing the way that we fund. And so we've outlined in this document a couple of the key things that we think would be enduring. And then are flagging areas that would require considerable review and refinement should we move to a transformed state. So I think what we would recommend is kind of almost creating two paths, like every time we come into the AOE, be able to pivot and say, assuming no changes, this is how we might recommend that. But assuming changes in a reform state, these are the additions. So wanted to just kind of share that approach with you for transparency, because I think we need to acknowledge we're dealing with a lot of complexity and uncertainty. And I would hate to see us develop a CTE bill on the current state and then have the education transformation come into effect and it not connect.
That's pretty much where we're at.
Okay.
This is whatever we put out there is not in stone.
Okay.
We want to understand. We want to understand. We don't understand where things are going. Yeah. And understand that we may need to pivot.
Mhm.
And so that's where we're at. And that's why we want to have the conversation with you and with Department of Labor, as well as CTE directors that are providing their services for different governance models that we have out there. And how do we work together to fold all of this in? And I just want it out there again, reiterate that we're starting from a place where we're working to put a system together that is best for the child, best for our students, and all other things fall behind that.
Mhm.
So we figure out what's best for the child, and then we'll figure out how we administer it and how people are paid and how the rules are developed and all that. But the utmost is what's best for our kids.
I had a couple points of clarification too, just around the bill as introduced. It's assuming existing tuitioning, or are you looking to propose funding changes?
Right now, we don't know where that's upstairs, and once we have that understanding, then we can, I think, look at that, right?
I would strongly recommend that the governance change come with funding change as well, because I think what we consistently hear is there's competition for dollars, and also there's a lot of variability with how we're funding different programs. So when we're being intentional about elevating quality and having consistency, I think it's going to be very critical that funding is part of that conversation. So just wanted to note that because it seemed that it was kind of relying on the existing, but that's probably just because of the nature of where we are in the planning.
And I think, you know, when we sat down with legislative council, I think we looked at what's existing already, what's the existing law, and how do we develop around existing law?
Right.
And, you know, we're open to away from that if we have to. We're open to pretty much anything. It's just, again, a starting point. And an area for, you know, start. Better play, a good place to start a discussion for. Michael, did you have?
Jody, you may want to turn off your volume.
There.
No, what, I mean, for what I'm about to say.
Oh, okay. I was like, you
Sorry.
can hear me? I'm on mute.
So this morning we had former Representative Sharp come in and he talked about comprehensive schools. And we kind of had that model at Spalding High School, at least when I went to school there, it felt like that. Certainly it was all part of one. What would your thoughts be on a statewide district that encompasses CTEs and high schools?
So I think the district is probably a separate response. Let me start with the kind of comprehensive high schools. That came through really clearly in our listen and learn that was a preference. We actually heard a desire for coordinated high school tech centers all on one campus to be able to really create better access to programs and to help connect students with different pathways. So I think that's a preference that has been expressed and that we've documented. A barrier to getting there are facilities in many instances. But I think as we're really designing our future state and the vision of Vermont, that's a part of the approach is really developing that tighter integration between high school and career and technical on the campus.
But if it was all under one umbrella, there wouldn't be the friction between the CTEs and the regular high school. And I guess, what are your thoughts about that part of it? Because is that workable in our current, and well, it's obviously not in our current, but we're talking about changing things. And if we're going to change things and we want it to work properly, we should probably consider just like redoing the entire thing, which is scary.
I heard that, yeah. So the transformation proposal that's put out there is looking at the integration between K-12 and CTE, and the proposal is intended to create stronger alignment. I think to answer your question around the friction, I think a lot of that can be solved when we are funding the appropriate levels and we're achieving scale. It's really hard to avoid the competition when you have a really small 11th or 12th grade class and being able to ensure that they can pursue CTE, they can take AP courses at the traditional school. Like it's really just, practically speaking, a challenge because the funding and the budget's not there to support an array of programming. So I think scale, regardless of district governance structure, is important to ensuring that we're able to offer those opportunities and that the funding needs to be sufficient to ensure that we're giving high quality opportunities. And the proposal that we put forward was really responsive to some of the challenges we heard in the field. There is a shared responsibility for that student between the district and the tech center. And so that's why we had some intention around ensuring dollars stayed at the district to support that student. And as a robust amount went to the tech centers as well. So I think any approach needs to be very mindful around funding for the shared responsibility of students and making sure that that's sufficient based on the type of support and activities that need to be provided for that child between the district and the tech center. Regarding governance, I think the governance piece is really helping us to achieve consistency in terms of quality, consistency in terms of goals, and being able to also have one consolidated Perkins plan that does allow us to differentiate by tech center, but really will be supportive of the state creating tighter alignment between programs and our workforce needs.
If we had that centralized governance, they could easily make decisions. Well, it wouldn't be easy because nothing's ever easy, but make decisions to reallocate students into different areas. So I talk about Central Vermont specifically, and I know we've had conversations before that Spalding High School, U32 could all fit in the same building. And I'll look to Jody because I'm sure we've had these conversations, and probably even the Career Center, if they, made some additions to that building. And that would get rid of one facility, which is costing us lots of money to maintain. And who knows, could sell it to somebody that will put it on the tax market or, the tax brackets. So that's kind of why I'm thinking that centralized district of both, and it gets rid of that friction, of course, of the CTE and high schools.
Are you saying one, just to make sure I'm understanding, a district for CTE centers or a district for the state?
Well, I'm okay with the entire state, which encompasses the high schools and the career centers.
Oh, okay, because the proposal that we put forward was one governance for the tech centers, absent the high school.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we need to think about what that model would look like. I don't know that I'd have to weigh kind of what those pros and cons, but how that would work in terms of supporting the overall student population at the district. I'm not sure.
I think what that does is just swap what we have right now with 11 of the CTE centers, is that the school boards have control over the funding. And they can decide whether or not. And an example is if there are funds remaining in a CTE center's budget where they want to use those funds for a new project in the next budget, the school board can remove those funds if they need to fill a hole in the arm. I don't want to see a reverse of that, where the CTEs, and I think what was spoken to us this morning was that CTEs centers would take control of all of the high schools. So you're just reversing the roles, and so I worry about the bias on CTE board for CTE, and we could have some high schools sitting out there that need funds. And those funds could be then put into the CTE center for something. So I'm really more interested in seeing CTE governance and seeing high school governance or the rest of it, not combining them. I just feel that we're swapping roles out.
And I wasn't really thinking of like combining in that way, because so it wouldn't be a CTE versus the high school, but it would just be one.
Well,
Right.
I mean, if we had a perfect world and we had tons of money, I think we would scrap all, because a lot of our union high schools are due for refurbishing or rebuilding because they're all 50 or 60 years old. If we could do that and we could combine districts into one high school with CTE as part of that, as a comprehensive high school, that would be perfect, but we're not in a perfect.
Right, we're we're designing transformation for a current system,
Yeah.
right? And so a question that I've had, and we've had lots of conversations already with the committee around, is there's a difference between getting to scale at K-12 and getting to scale for CTE, right? When you're thinking about serving about 5,000 students across the state. And so the idea with the single governance is to really ensure that there is the right expertise and support for those students across the entire state, and that it would make more sense for that to be housed within one governance as opposed to embedded in multiple districts. And so that's in the direction that we're headed. Should our enrollment in a couple of decades look really different, right? That might be a time to revisit that. But I think given where we are and the type of focus we want to have around CTE, and the desire to expand and promote greater quality, that's why we put forward that recommendation for a governance unit for CTE. I'm looking at some of the other notes here for the areas. I think there's an opportunity also with this governance to, establish consistent policies and procedures for data collection and reporting, establishing consistent enrollment and admissions policies. I do think that can be achieved, some of what was described around identifying kind of where programs are operating. I mean, I think that can still happen within this framework. Ensuring the access to curriculum and resources, and providing that professional development support. And so, I think we've enumerated here what the proposed roles would be of a single governance entity. I do want to reinforce that would need to operate within a reformed and consistent funding model, because just changing the governance, we would still have some of the inequity and variability that we have in our system now, that I think we're trying to address.
Do you think that I guess when we took our approach that, we're looking, we didn't drill down too deep, because I think some of the things you were talking about are actually duties that the new board would take on, of developing their policies and procedures and the rules and working with AOE of structuring all of that. I don't, is that how you envision us going forward, or do you envision more direction in the legislative language?
I think, as I mentioned, I think we're at kind of an awkward point, right? I think there's a lot of value in making sure that we focus on CTE this session, and that we're able to push legislation forward that's going to help to improve our system. So everyone's there. I think it's going to be really important that we get more concrete on what it would look like within a reformed state, so that it could be a companion for legislation passed this session on the connection to K-12. So I think we're committed to providing additional input both paths forward, but I do think we'd want to have more specificity, and a direct ask from this committee was to really think about roles and responsibilities more, and making sure that we're not, creating more layers of bureaucracy, that we're really being intentional around how to create an efficient and effective system. So I do think that's really important to get concrete on. So we attempted in this most recent follow-up to incorporate some of the questions, ideas that you shared, and thinking about how that might change or be amended with different transformation approaches. But I think we're landing on a single governance structure. I think that seems to be consistent. What might be helpful is for the committee to really identify what the key questions you have around how that would be organized within the current state and reform state, for us to be able to provide some additional input. And we do have some legislative language also that we can share.
I guess kind of to touch on what Michael was saying, something that I think about with this is the idea that CTE is more of a teaching structure than anything. That it's one part of the day is focused on academics and that sort of thing. And then the other one is the other, side of the day is much more hands-on learning, which I guess in my mind feels like it should be able as a strategy to be spread across from pre-K to 12. But what I'm understanding, I think the more that we talk is that WIOA guidelines kind of offers a little bit of a difficulty in unifying the systems.
Yeah, we've been providing some of that technical support to the field because we do know that some of our students need some additional support in the core academic areas. I think that's
Sorry. What I'm actually talking about is like the financial factor of WIOA having to create competitive grants that are more widely open. Because if we were to change our system, we would be out of step with those funds. So we wouldn't have those funds and we would have to figure out how to backfill.
if we changed what part of our system?
If we stopped aligning with WIOA, if we decided that that wasn't going to be a competitive grant, if we decided to integrate our system entirely, I'm guessing that would have implications on WIOA funding.
We're talking about 9 through 12 CTE, not the adult side.
Okay, so now the question. So the 9 through 12 is that covered by WIOA?
There can be WIOA funds utilized.
But it's not primarily covered with
Right.
WIOA
Yeah.
funding.
Right.
Okay.
Perkins
So
funding.
Yeah.
Perkins funding.
Right.
Okay, so there actually would not necessarily be these are not being funded by two completely separate pots of money that are not, okay.
I mean,
So they could come together, we could think about a more comprehensive, because I think what I get stuck up on, and I could be very wrong, but it seems like because we already have issues with our buildings, we already have some alignment concerns as far as governance goes. Is there a way that we could look at starting to integrate these systems a little bit more closely without risking any funding?
I'd want Ruth Durkee to be able to respond to that. And I think also Department of Labor can weigh in as we're talking. I think what you're describing is how are we really intentional about creating that cradle to career pathway and the rating and alignment of funding. I can speak to what we've proposed in terms of the education transformation is thinking about how we're providing earlier exposure in middle school and making sure that the base funding amount supports that, and that also in 9th and 12th grade, there's funding available to continue with that work. I think a lot of times what happens is student will be in 10th grade and they didn't know that a career and technical education pathway would be available to them, right? And so we're really trying to think intentionally around how to create that exposure and those opportunities for students to learn about career and technical pathways much earlier on. And so that is some intentional work we're doing around the proposal and bringing forward different funding and prioritizing early exposure and support in career and technical education.
Yeah, so I appreciate the interchange around, so if you need more specificity or, is that something to be left to the board to do? Or you're looking for a little more specificity, maybe in some of the legislation around handling some of these issues. And I'm thinking back, well, how would I sort of think about that? And I would naturally personally gravitate to the APA report and, a bunch of recommendations, policy recommendations around trying to address some of I think you mentioned two problems, variability in programming and some of those competitive issues where you don't have alignment between high schools and CTE. And I guess the question is that a reasonable point to start in terms of looking at the APA recommendations and thinking about, is that the kind of specificity that you're looking for in terms of what we as a committee can offer?
Mhm. Yes, so we've actually in the process of taking those recommendations and putting those into legislative language so that there's some additional details and really working collaboratively with Department of Labor and making sure that we're bringing forward kind of a aligned recommendation.
And to be clear, that doesn't necessarily say whether it should be, for the board to flesh those out or necessarily the legislature flesh those out, but at least trying to get a list of the things that we need to get specific.
Yep. So it sounds like what would be most helpful to you is bringing back, based on the bill that was introduced, where we might recommend having further specificity within statute and what can be defined through rule. Is that what I'm hearing? Okay.
It would be a good process for us to think about BOCES model and the model that we proposed. And what are the, benefits of each one and drawbacks of each one. So that we can better understand your thoughts on why you and APA have now looking at a BOCES model instead of just a straight district.
So that really evolved through the process of looking at the broader transformation and thinking about how we could be intentional around creating efficiency and effectiveness and not layering on. And I think that's a big concern also for this committee is we don't want to create additional layers of bureaucracy that get in the way of what we're trying to achieve. So the BOCES felt like it provided some flexibility. I think what we're coming to is that, what we've outlined here is that let's be really clear on what we're trying to achieve with the single statewide governance structure. And then to your point, identifying if there are the pros and cons, right? Because certainly within the BOCES model, the student is still registered within their district. They still receive their diploma from their district. They're still receiving some additional support and counseling and services from the district. So that's going to be built into the model. So I think we'd have to have some questions if it were really designed as a separate district, maybe what additional resources would need to be available or supported and how that would be funded. So I think it's a question.
Yeah, to add to that, I think the rest of the question is how does a student move between districts seamlessly, right? Because yes, some students are doing this part-time. So, and even the students that are doing this full-time currently today still have, in some instances, right, in some governance structures, 1 or 2 classes in their home district. So, right, so having the 2 different systems, there are pros and cons to both. So I think, yes, we absolutely need to understand it. And I heard what you said earlier about a reason not to, because this is something I'm wrestling with still, a reason not to have the CTE centers as part of the bigger districts is that we would never get to a scale to be able to offer all of the resources necessary in all of the different regions, I guess, or whatever the new district configuration turns out to be. But that is the system that would simplify these other things more, right? So I think, right, I think that once we figure out what this new structure is, that we will know, right? What is, is it 1,000 students in each area? Is it 4,000 students in one area and some breakdown of the other in the other? I think that is going to be important.
So there's been robust conversation in our team around that very matter. And the smaller your districts are, I think the greater the need is for a single statewide CTE governance structure. And then just because the goal is so that you're having the expertise, the shared alignment of curriculum and resources, that becomes increasingly challenging to do the smaller that your districts are, because it's also hard to staff up to have the right support to achieve that. I think your question is if within like the 5 district model, is that sufficient scale? And that was a question that we certainly had as well. I think to fully answer your question, we could probably do some modeling around what would that look like staffing wise, what would that comparing it within a larger district to one governance structure. I still think there's really a need for that specialized support and that needing to be provided statewide and not just located within a district. And I think as we've evaluated the pros and cons, we've come forward with a recommendation for a single statewide governance structure. And as I said, I think that becomes even more important if you have smaller districts.
And then this, just to go back to a little bit of what Emily was saying is if we were to have CTE centers within districts across the state, could we have a single Perkins grant for the state that is done at the AOE? Like, is that a possibility even within the Perkins structure, right? I'm not an expert in this area. I'm putting this out there to you and to the rest of the
Yeah.
field, right? Is that even a way to get some kind of economy of scale and to make our state dollars go farther, right? Like, and so how do we, can we be creative around that within the rules that we are aware
And I think you're pointing to another key piece of having a single statewide governance structure is being able to manage the Perkins Fund that way and have one application that's still customized for the districts, right? And that really was, that's what we saw as the creative mechanism really for the BOCES. I think we get into a challenge when we have to monitor ourselves, right? And so there's roles that the agency has to play in terms of monitoring and oversight. And there needs to be some separation between that and implementation, right? And
we do that in state government, liquor and lottery, right? We have expertise in how to do that in state. So I think
I'll just share, that's a consideration, right? Right, as we think about the roles and responsibilities and trying to keep those lines clean. This was what was proposed as a way to do that. I think what I'm hearing you ask is if there are other ways to do that just within the AOE of funding that. We'd have to.
And again, I'm putting it to you and to other folks who are going to be testifying. I am not an expert on Perkins. Putting it out there.
I'm going to say that Ruth is the expert on Perkins, so I will defer to her. So,
What do you want
Yeah,
to?
I was,
Yeah,
go through your presentation.
do you want to go through the different roles and responsibilities that we've updated? Okay. So the document that we uploaded for you is Jody?
We have you.
Yeah. We can scale the result.
And our intent here was, really first being very clear on roles and responsibilities. I think that helps us to provide more focused feedback around the legislative language to make sure we're capturing things correctly. So just to orient you to how we've organized this, we did identify what we see as the positives of moving towards a single statewide governance. I think there's discussion around what that looks like. Is that a district? Is it a BOCES? Is it a education service agency? And then we have highlighted throughout this document some key decision points. So one key decision point are CTE center staff employed by the statewide governance entity or by local districts. I think that's a key decision point. That will determine where a lot of these roles and responsibilities will fall in terms of the employment. APA has recommended that staff are employed by that single governance entity. And they're looking at models across the country where that has been effective, and we can share some of those examples with you. And the idea would have consistency and expectations, streamlining processes, and really a true statewide approach to CTE. So I think as the chair mentioned, there's kind of a need to protect CTE, and that's kind of part of this intent with the governance structure is to ensure that it's funded appropriately and has the right oversight and support to protect CTE and resource it appropriately.
I'm trying to follow, are you referencing a particular document that you uploaded, or is it this?
It's this, yeah.
And where, I'm sorry, so where are we?
I can,
Where are you at?
like, I can log in to share my screen. Would that be helpful?
Oh, someone will help me. I'm okay. Emily will help. Emily will help me.
It's always good to get help.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry. Would it be helpful? You want me to-
Yeah.
Why not?
Why don't we take a short break? And secretary can get a computer up and, so let's come back in 10 minutes. We'll be back at 25 minutes.